years ago. And we're in Africa. 60,000 years ago, some phenomena appear that separated us from our ancestors. And the phenomena that began to appear were writings on walls, attention to burying the dead, and migration for some reason other than the environment, disasters, or a search for following herds. So those three interesting things: writing on walls, burying the dead, and migration. And when you kind of tumble them together, I think you can read into that suddenly, for the first time, there's a hunger in some part of creation for something that we can't see, that is beyond us, that is out there somewhere. We write paintings on a wall for people who are not there, someone who is not there. We start to bury the dead because we believe there's something after death. And we go in search of something. We go on migration, on journeys, not because we're looking for more land or more vegetation or more animals to hunt, but we're looking for something else. So I think we can read in those changes the emergence of a hunger for the transcendence, for something beyond us that has been placed in human hearts and is now causing this change in behavior, causing this change, this effort to find out something more. We do not know what it was. We don't know where to find it. We just have a sense that there's something more in life. So when I read that, I thought to myself, okay, that works for me. I can imagine how God would breathe into the human experience a divine soul at some point. And breathing a divine soul into us is the creation of that impulse that eventually leads to prayer. That made some sense to me. I thought, I think that I can understand that maybe 60,000 years ago, that's when God breathed into humanity and created humanity this hunger for the transcendence, this hunger for something more, this search for something beyond what I am presently experiencing. And in Pope Francis's terms, he says, it's almost as if God has planted a memory in the human heart of an encounter, of some encounter. We know not with who, but some encounter, and so we are going in search of the you. I am going in search of a you that I do not know. I do not know how to find you. I just know that you are somehow calling to me. You're asking me something. I want to make sure that if you're here, you can see my paintings, you can respect those who have died, and I'm going on a search now, a journey, a pilgrimage, wandering in search of finding you at last. So I love those connections. They were helpful to me because at some point we should be able to say to everybody around us, prayer's universal. It doesn't belong to religious people. Prayer is implanted in all human beings. It's there in everyone. What shape it takes, that's interesting, but it's there in everyone. It's not the private property of anyone. I love that kind of image because I like talking to my green nephews and nieces about the connections between their world, the world of science, the world of physics, the world of the evolution, and the world of the church. I like that idea. There's an old Chinese proverb, and I came across it somewhere, and they said, when you teach the child the name of a bird, they no longer see the bird. I thought that was really interesting. Our problem often is we know too much about God, we know information about God, but we don't often take the time to encounter God. The information we have about God gets in the way of our own experience of God, gets in the way of our own meeting with God. So in some ways what Pope Francis is doing on his introduction to prayer is trying to get us back to having that encounter with God and not giving us information about God, trying to give us an encounter with God and not just more data about God. So I like that idea. So God, he creates this awareness of the longing for him, and then God chooses to reveal himself to us. He says, I planted the longing in your heart. I've planted this impulse in your hearts, and now I'm going to disclose myself to you so you can find your way to me. So that you can find your way to me. I don't want to leave you lost and sort of adrift in this world. So he creates the longing, and then God creates a path to find the longing. And for Pope Francis, he says the beginning of that path is creation. It starts with creation. He said, if you look at the story of our faith, the first words of our story is the story of Genesis, which we listen to over Easter time, at the vigil, on the first day, on the second day. What emerges in that is this wonderful world that God has created, and it's a world that has been created out of chaos. That God has brought order into this world, has made this world a meaningful place for us, a meaningful place for us to inhabit, and it's a place that is on our side. It is for us. It's not hostile to us. Yes, there's lots of hostility there, but it's fundamentally on our side. And one of his references for it is the beautiful Psalm 8. So we'll just listen to that. It's a story of creation from the Psalms.
O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Lovely description of creation. And in the middle of it all, the psalmist says, who are we? Because you can imagine this scene. We're looking up at the immensity of the stars, the immensity of this world, and in comparison, we're such a puny, insignificant creature in comparison to all of that. But, he said, what makes us unique is we can appreciate the Creator behind it all. We are unique in that we're the only creature who can see the beauty and see the God behind all that has been created. We have this wonderful power to interpret and to understand creation, unlike all other living creatures. We have that capacity, that wonderful ability. And he goes on to say in here is that the psalmist recognizes that this is a good place to be. Now, one of the interesting things about the story of Genesis, when that was written in Israel's history, is that was not a happy time for Israel. You know, they were not on the land, crops coming in, you know, sheep looking after their herds. They were in exile. They had lost the temple. They had lost their ritual sacrifices. They were the underclass. They were down in Babylon and Nineveh. They'd lost all of the blessings, even their own land that God had promised to them. This is not a happy time. So what's extraordinary about that story that we hear every year at Easter time, the story of creation, is it's at a very low point in their journey. They come up with this wonderful story of creation. And a wonderful story about how God is at work in creation, how God fashioned all of this. So it wasn't prompted by having a great life. In fact, it's almost the opposite. They had to work to look at this world around them and see something good in it. They had to work really hard to be able to look at creation and see creation as a really good thing, even though right now I am not personally experiencing its benefits. That was really interesting for them. So it's almost like they had to take a stand against their own experience in favor of God. I'm not experiencing the goodness of creation. I'm not having a happy time right now. But when I look out here, I still see the goodness of God. I still see the power of God at work on my behalf. And Pope Francis says to us, which way are we going to go? He said, we can be bearers of joy and bearers of seeing the goodness of God, or we can be bearers of sadness. And we can communicate sadness and discouragement. He said those are choices we make. They're not predetermined. And they're certainly not determined by our experience. Those are choices. I can be a person who's going to bring joy to others, or I'm going to be a person who brings sadness to others. Israel chose joy. Israel chose to see the goodness of God in creation, even though they weren't at that point experiencing God's benefits. So Pope Francis asks us in our prayer, when we look at creation, the world around us, can we always look at it, regardless of our experience, as a gift from God, as a gift that God gives to us to show that God is on our side? When I look at this world, can I always see that? Or does it depend on whether I got rain when I wanted it and sunshine when I wanted it? Does it depend on my experience, or can I choose to interpret it that way? So the first part of this was creation communicates to us the goodness of God, God's power to create order out of chaos and to reveal creation as something good for us. The second step on that journey is, out of all the voices, and we have to keep in mind that Israel was traveling through landscapes that were populated with spiritual powers, spiritual forces. Everywhere Israel traveled, there was a pile of rocks. This is a sacred place. There was a well. This is a holy well. There was a mountain. This is a holy mountain. There were gods for this, gods for that, gods for this. Everybody was chattering. It's a noisy, noisy place. We think the internet is a noisy place. Probably for Israel, it was a pretty noisy place. This whole world, everybody saying, listen to this God, offer sacrifice to this God, watch out what's going on with the weather. This God is in charge of the harvest. This God is in charge of the war. This God is in charge of the sea. All of that stuff. And you have a sense in there when you're traveling through that landscape, well, it's a bit of a coin toss, you know. If you picked the right God, maybe you got lucky. If you didn't, you were in trouble. Out of all of that, we have this figure, Abraham, who hears one voice above all the rest, which is really extraordinary. And Abraham chooses to trust in the Word. He becomes, in a sense, the first human being who is shaped not by events and not by stars and not by the weather and not by storms, but by a voice in his heart that has given him a promise. And Pope Francis says that's an extraordinary development in our life of prayer. Can we also hear that voice that Abraham heard? Can we hear this voice who offers a promise to us of a future and a promise to meet us on our journey? So for the first time, God is not to be located in wells and mountains and trees and sacred places. God is going to be discovered now in history. And not just anybody's history, but your history. God's going to be discovered in your path as you travel. That's where God is going to meet you. And Pope Francis has a lovely image in there. He said, can you believe in God on a starless night, where there's nothing up there to tell you which way to go? There's no promise up there that your children are going to be as many as the stars in the sky. Can you believe in God on a starless night and believe in the promise that's located in our hearts? I thought that was a lovely image, so that our faith now becomes history on this journey. Francis wants to know, can we understand that God accompanies us? So all of this stuff that we've been reflecting on, about God accompanying us, grace accompanying us, accompaniment in difficult times, at the center of all of that is God's accompanying us, individually and as a people, on this journey with a promise that God can make that journey for us. It's not an easy journey, and so after Pope Francis makes that connection from creation to the story to the promise, then he says, and now it involves a struggle. It involves a battle. So he tells the story, and it's an interesting choice. He tells the story about the two brothers, Jacob and Esau. So I just remember this story as a kid because Esau had to put put some fur on himself so he could steal the blessing from his father. Do you remember that old story in the Bible? You have to be my age or older to remember that story. And he snuck in there ahead of his kid, his older brother, and he got the blessing, and then he hides out of town and heads off to the hills, and they never see each other again. So there's his Jacob. He's off, and he's built a fortune. He's got all these flocks. He's got all this wealth. He's independent. He's got big family. And in his heart, he has this sense is, I have to go home. I have to reconnect with my roots. So he makes this great journey back, and all the time he's wondering about, how am I going to be received by Esau? Because he stole everything from Esau. And he's had this Teflon life, you know. No problems, smooth sailing, lots of money, everything's worked out well for him. He comes to the Jabbok River in the Old Testament, and then he is on one side of the bank, and he's put all of his crops, all of everybody else is on the other side of the bank, and he has this encounter. So we're going to listen to that encounter about Jacob on the banks of the Jabbok River.
Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him, and he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip.
Lovely story. So up until this point, he's been untouchable. He's been sailing along, money's been flowing in, crops have been harvested, the sheep have been multiplying, until he has this encounter on the river, lasts all night long, and when he finally gets to the morning, something's changed in him, and he no longer can walk the way he once walked. And it's a physical injury, but Jacob now walks with a limp. And what Pope Francis wants us to understand is that in our journey, we are all going to have to be humbled if we're going to encounter this God of ours. If we think we can make this journey completely on our own, no problems, save up all our money, purchase everything we need, sail on through life, we have no need of mercy. It's Teflon. The mercy just skips off us. But he said everybody eventually has some kind of night where there's problems. Things go off the rail. I experience some kind of disaster, some kind of disappointment. The temptation is to look at that and say, I'm out of here. This is not what I bargained for. Pope Francis says, yes, it is. This is exactly how God is going to meet us. And God is going to humble us, because until God humbles us, he's not going to be able to flood us with grace, flood us with mercy, because we don't think we need it. So it's really interesting. He says, so when we find those season of disorientation or disappointment or some kind of failure in our life or some kind of sadness that overwhelms us, we ought to look at this as this is our Jabbok River moment. This is the time when we're encountering God, and we're going to come out of this changed. We're going to come out of this different. We're going to come out of this vulnerable and more wounded. But that is going to be the door that opens us to grace, and it will show up in our prayer. It'll show up in our thanksgiving to God for in my hour of need, you humbled me, and now you are accompanying me on the journey. Do you get a little sense about that? So you can see that progression, so that there's this longing in our hearts. Creation kind of affirms it, a promise that echoes inside of us that we're going to learn to trust, a humbling experience at the river that reminds us that we are not so independent, we're not so powerful, we're not so strong, and that we're going to have to learn to trust in that. And then the last part of this is he talks about the importance of the cry for mercy. And he uses the lovely story of Bartimaeus by the side of the road. So we'll listen to that story of Bartimaeus.
A reading from the Gospel of Mark. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way.
A lovely story of Bartimaeus. So some of the comments that Pope Francis makes about the story is he said, this Jericho, it's the crossroads of the world at that time. So everybody's passing through this. He said it's a little bit like where we find Zacchaeus. He's up in the tree. It's a very, very busy environment. And he said, and in the middle of this, we have Bartimaeus. And he said, in a sense, we ought to see ourselves all as if I am Bartimaeus, that we are all blind beggars in the middle of this chaotic world. And he said, what does Bartimaeus have? What does he possess that enables him to reach God? And Pope Francis says, all he has is his cry. He has nothing else. He doesn't have any other tool. The only weapon he has is this cry for mercy. And Pope Francis notes, he said, and it's a cry that the culture and the world around us wants to suppress. So the crowds, even the disciples, are telling him, be quiet. Keep silent. Don't cry out. Pope Francis says, that's a lack of faith. He said, anytime we're told not to cry out, not to make this appeal, that's a voice of disbelief, saying you should settle for what you have. You should be content with your lot. Don't expect anything more. Don't expect healing. Don't expect any kind of transformation in your life. Don't expect any of that. He said, that's the voice that says we should put up with the misery in our life and not launch this cry for help to God. Pope Francis, this is our posture in the world. 2 hands raised in prayer, crying for mercy. But he said, I love Bartimaeus' stubborn faith. Despite everything the disciples say, despite everything the crowd says, he would not keep silent. And he keeps making this cry for help, this cry for mercy to God. And that's the cry that pierces the heavens, pierces the heart of God, and brings about healing and brings about life. So Pope Francis says, we are all like Bartimaeus on the side of the road. The world around us tells us to be quiet, tells us to shut up. He said, but it's that cry that brings mercy back into the world. And he said, that's the cry that helps everyone around us to understand this world is on our side because it's God's world. It's made for us. And God is a God of mercy. So if that cry doesn't rise from our own hearts, that's a lack of faith on our part. It's a lack of faith to recognize God wants to hear our cry. God wants to answer us, and God wants to bless us with his gift of mercy. So I love this introduction that Pope Francis has given us to prayer. Idea that he's planted an impulse in our heart, and then he wants to reveal himself to us. He does it in creation. He does it in our attempts to hear that voice, the need for silence, the need for listening. We talked about that on our journey. We talked about that struggle to reattach myself to our roots, to be humbled, to discover that I'm part of the earth, and then to recognize that this cry for mercy that's in my heart has been planted there by God, and I need to be attentive to it. I should never abandon it. I should make sure that I keep offering that cry to God, and eventually that cry will pierce the heavens and invite the mercy of God to be showered upon us. So those are just some of his thoughts about that, and we can chat a little bit about that over some coffee, and I think we even have some goodies. So thanks to that, and we'll catch up after Mass over coffee.